the afternoon sun hung low and golden over the English countryside, casting long, warm shadows across the riverbank, where a young girl named Alice sat with her elder sister. The grass beneath her was soft and slightly damp, fragrant with the scent of clover and wild chamomile. It was the kind of lazy, golden afternoon that seemed to stretch on forever, where time itself appeared to slow down, and the world grew hazy and gentle at its edges. A warm breeze drifted lazily through the willow trees that lined the water's edge. Their long, trailing branches sweeping the surface of the river like delicate green curtains being drawn aside by an invisible hand. Alice sat cross-legged on the grass, her blue dress spread out around her like a flower petal, and she gazed at the book her sister held open in her lap. It was a thick book, densely printed with words that seemed to crawl across the page like tiny black ants marching in endless, meaningless lines. There were no pictures in it, not a single one, and for Alice, who possessed a vivid and restless imagination, a book without pictures was hardly a book at all. It was more like a punishment, a wall of text designed to trap the mind rather than set it free. What is the use of a book? Alice thought to herself, allowing her chin to come to rest in the palm of her hand. Without pictures or conversations, she let out a soft, bored sigh that carried away on the breeze and dissolved into the warm summer air. Her sister, absorbed in the dry text before her, did not notice. The river murmured its quiet, endless song. A dragonfly hovered briefly above the water, its iridescent wings catching the sunlight like tiny panes of stained glass before it darted away and was gone. Alice's eyelids were beginning to grow heavy. The combination of the warm sun on her skin, the gentle sound of the water, and the utter boredom of having nothing to occupy her active young mind was creating a thick, drowsy fog that was slowly settling over her thoughts. She felt as though she were wrapped in a warm, soft blanket that was being pulled tighter and tighter around her, coaxing her toward sleep. But then, just as her eyes were about to flutter shut, something caught her attention. It was a flash of white, a darting, quick movement in the grass just at the edge of her vision. Alice blinked, and the drowsiness fell away from her like a shed skin. She turned her head sharply and stared. There, bounding across the riverbank with remarkable speed, was a white rabbit. Now, a rabbit on a riverbank was not in itself a remarkable thing. Alice had seen rabbits before, but this rabbit was different. This rabbit was extraordinary. For one thing, it had pink eyes that gleamed with an almost intelligent light. For another, and this was the detail that made Alice's breath catch in her throat, it was wearing a waistcoat, a neatly pressed, well-tailored waistcoat with polished brass buttons that caught the sunlight as the creature moved. Alice stared. She rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand and stared again. The rabbit was still there, still running, still wearing its waistcoat. It had not vanished. It was not a trick of the fading light or a trick of her tired mind. And then the rabbit spoke. "Oh dear, oh dear, I shall be late," it said in a hurried, anxious voice, quite clearly and distinctly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a rabbit to wear a waistcoat and speak English on a summer afternoon. Alice's heart gave a great leap in her chest. A talking rabbit. A talking rabbit in a waistcoat. She had read about such things in storybooks. Of course, rabbits who wore clothes and held tea parties and lived in holes in the ground. But she had never imagined, not even in her wildest dreams, that she might actually encounter one in real life. Burning with curiosity, she scrambled to her feet, her drowsiness entirely forgotten and began to follow the rabbit. She moved quickly, her shoes pressing into the soft earth, her eyes fixed on the flash of white as it darted through the tall grass. The rabbit did not seem to notice her. It was too preoccupied with its own urgent business, glancing nervously at a pocket watch that it produced from its waistcoat pocket, checking the time with every few strides. Oh dear, I shall be late, it repeated, its voice growing more frantic. The rabbit reached a thick hedge that bordered the river bank, and without hesitating, it dove straight into a large rabbit hole that nestled at the base of the hedge. Alice, caught up in the thrill of the chase, and not thinking for a moment about the wisdom of what she was doing, followed. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the hole and peered inside. It was dark, impossibly dark, a deep, round tunnel that seemed to descend into the very earth itself, straight down like a well. She could still hear the rabbit's voice, faint and distant, echoing up from somewhere far below. Oh dear, I shall be late. And then, before she could reconsider, before she could think about turning back or calling for her sister, Alice felt herself leaning forward, and then she was falling. The earth gave way beneath her, and she was tumbling, dropping, sinking into darkness. Down, down she fell. It was not a frightening fall. Strangely, it was almost pleasant. The air around her was cool and soft, and she fell slowly, so slowly that she had plenty of time to look around her as she descended. The sides of the well-like tunnel were lined with bookshelves of all things, bookshelves with books and maps and pictures hanging from pegs. She reached out as she fell and plucked a jar from one of the shelves. It had a label on it that read orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment, it was empty. She set it carefully on another shelf as she passed, not wanting to drop it and potentially hit someone on the head far below. Down, down, down. Would the fall never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time," she said aloud, her voice echoing strangely in the vertical space around her. "I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see. That would be 4,000 miles down, I think." She pondered this for a moment. The idea of falling through the earth and coming out on the other side in Australia or New Zealand, perhaps, was both thrilling and slightly alarming. She hoped she wouldn't fall right through to the other side, where people walked about with their heads pointing downward. That would be very awkward, she thought. She would have to ask them what the name of their country was. "Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia?" She imagined herself saying, and the thought made her giggle, even as she continued to fall. Down, down, down. The darkness was absolute now, and the bookshelves had given way to bare, earthen walls. Alice began to feel rather sleepy again, despite the extraordinary nature of her situation. She could have easily fallen asleep as she fell, had it not been for the distant, rhythmic thudding sound that reached her ears, a sound like footsteps, or perhaps the beating of a great drum coming from somewhere far below. Thump, thump, thump. And then suddenly the bottom of the fall arrived, not with a crash or a jolt, but with a soft, gentle landing, as though she had fallen onto a pile of feathers or a mountain of cushions. Alice found herself sitting on a grassy bank, surrounded by soft, mossy ground and dim, ambient light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She was unhurt. Not a single scratch or bruise marred her skin. She stood up quickly and looked around. Ahead of her, the white rabbit was still visible, hurrying down a long, low passage that stretched into the distance. It was still checking its pocket watch and still muttering about being late. Alice sprinted after it, her footsteps light and silent on the mossy ground. But the rabbit turned a corner, and when Alice rounded the same corner a moment later, the passage was empty. The rabbit had vanished. She found herself standing in a long, low hall that was lit by a row of lamps hanging from the ceiling. The hall was not particularly remarkable in its architecture, but what made Alice stop in her tracks and stare in wonder were the doors. There were doors, everywhere doors, all along the walls, on both sides. Doors lining the ceiling overhead. Doors set into the floor beneath her feet. Every single one of them was locked. Alice tried them all. She went from door to door, turning handles and pushing panels, but none of them budged. Not one. She was locked in, trapped in this hall of endless locked doors, and a small, sharp pang of anxiety began to needle at her chest. Then, just as she was beginning to feel truly disheartened, she noticed something she had missed. A low curtain at the far end of the hall, and behind it, a little door about 15 inches high. She hurried over and tried the handle. To her immense relief, it turned. The door was not locked. She knelt down and peered through the opening. Beyond the door was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. It was small, of course. She could only see a small portion of it through the 15-inch opening. But what she could see took her breath away. Bright, vivid flower beds lined smooth gravel paths. Fountains sparkled in the soft light, their water catching the glow of the lamps and throwing tiny rainbows into the air. Flowering trees stood in neat rows, their blossoms heavy and fragrant. It was a garden of impossible perfection, the kind of garden that existed only in dreams and fairy tales. Alice longed to get into that garden. She longed for it with a fierce, aching desire that surprised even her. But she could not. The door was far too small. She was far too large. She stood up and walked back down the hall, her mind racing, searching for a solution. And that was when she found the glass table. It was a 3-legged glass table, and sitting upon it was a golden key. Alice's heart leaped. She picked up the key and examined it. It was small and delicate, clearly designed for a small and delicate lock. She rushed back to the curtain, dropped to her knees, and tried the key in the little door. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked open, but when she tried to pass through the door, she found that she still could not. Even with the door unlocked, the opening was only 15 inches high, and Alice was very much larger than 15 inches. She was, as she had always been, a normal-sized girl, and normal-sized girls do not fit through 15-inch doors, no matter how much they might want to. She closed the door again and stood there frowning, the golden key clutched in her hand, feeling a frustration that bordered on tears. And then, as she looked back down the hall, she noticed something new, something that had not been there before. On the glass table beside the spot where the key had been, there now sat a small bottle. It was round, with a paper label tied around its neck, and on the label, in beautifully printed letters, were the words, "Drink me." Alice examined the bottle carefully. She was not a foolish child. She had been taught not to drink things that she found lying around, especially not in strange halls beneath the earth. She looked for a poison label, but found none. The bottle did not say poison. It simply said, "Drink me." And the bottle itself was quite charming. Its glass was a lovely amber color, and the liquid inside shimmered faintly. Well, Alice said to herself, reasoning it through with the careful logic of a well-brought-up young lady, I'll drink some of it, and if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key on the table, and if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door. Either way, I'll get into the garden. And she raised the bottle to her lips and took a careful sip. The taste was extraordinary. A complex, layered flavor that was part cherry tart, part custard, part pineapple, part roast turkey, part toffee, and part hot buttered toast. She drank it all, and then the changes began. She felt a curious shrinking sensation, as though she were being folded in on herself, compressed like a telescope being closed. The hall seemed to grow around her, the ceiling rising higher and higher, the walls stretching away, the lamps receding into the distance until they looked like tiny stars. In a matter of moments, Alice was no taller than 10 inches. She was exactly the right size to pass through the little door. But there was a problem, a very significant problem. The key was still on the glass table, and the glass table was now towering above her like a skyscraper. She couldn't reach it. She was the right size for the door, but she couldn't unlock the door because the key was out of her reach. The irony of the situation was not lost on Alice, and she sat down on the floor and felt very much like crying. But Alice was not the kind of girl who cried for long when there was a problem to be solved. She looked around and soon spotted something else that had not been there before. A little glass box lying beneath the table. Inside the box was a small cake, and on the cake, in currants, were the words, "Eat me." "Well," Alice said, with the pragmatism that would serve her well throughout her adventures, "I'll eat it. If it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key. And if it makes me grow smaller, well, I can creep under the door. Either way, something will happen." So she ate the cake, and she grew. She grew and grew and grew. Her body expanded rapidly, filling the hall, her head pressing against the ceiling, her arms stretching out to the walls. In moments, she was enormous, so large that she could barely move, so large that she was cramped and uncomfortable and thoroughly miserable. One of her arms was stuck through the doorway leading to the garden, and her foot was wedged against one of the ceiling doors. She could see the garden through the little door, could see the bright flowers and the sparkling fountains. But she was far too large to enter. Oh, "How I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice, trying to find some humor in her predicament, for she had indeed cried a great deal earlier, and now found herself in a situation where her tears might prove useful. She could feel a large pool of tears forming around her. Tears she had shed earlier when she was small, now become a significant body of water at her feet. Just then she heard a familiar sound, a scurrying, hurrying sound, and then a voice, that anxious, hurried voice. "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess. Oh, my dear paws. Oh, my fur and whiskers. She'll get me executed as sure as ferrets are ferrets. Oh, I can't find my way out. I don't know which way to go." It was the White Rabbit. Alice could hear it approaching, and she called out to it, her voice booming in the confined space. "Mr. Rabbit, if you please, could you help me?" The rabbit startled violently. It gave a sharp squeak of fear and dropped its fan and its pair of kid gloves. And then it turned and fled at top speed, disappearing down the hall as though the devil himself were chasing it. Alice picked up the fan and the gloves. The fan was small and delicate, clearly made for the rabbit's tiny paws. She began fanning herself with it, and as she did so, she noticed something was happening. She was shrinking again. The fan was causing her to grow smaller. She dropped it quickly, but it was too late. She was already diminishing, growing smaller and smaller, until she was once again her original size, and then continuing to shrink past it, growing tinier and tinier until she was no more than 2 inches tall. And then she slipped. Her foot caught on the edge of the pool of tears, her own tears, shed when she was large, and she fell head first into the water with a splash that was, to her tiny frame, like falling into a lake. The water closed over her head, and for a moment she flailed and splashed, tasting the salt of her own tears. she managed to right herself and began to swim, paddling through the warm, salty water with clumsy but determined strokes. And then she heard splashing near her. Something else was in the water. She turned and saw, to her astonishment, a mouse. A large brown mouse swimming beside her with strong, confident strokes. "Oh, mouse," Alice called out, her tiny voice echoing over the surface of the water. "Do you know the way out of this pool? I'm very tired of swimming about here, oh mouse." The mouse looked at her with dark, beady eyes. It did not seem pleased to be addressed. It twitched its whiskers and said nothing. Alice tried again. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English. Perhaps it's a French mouse." She dredged up from her memory the little French she had learned in her lessons. "Où est ma chat?" she said, which means, "Where is my cat?" The effect of these words on the mouse was immediate and dramatic. It shuddered from head to tail. Its eyes went wide with terror, and it seemed to shrink away from Alice as though she had said the most horrifying thing imaginable. "Oh, I beg your pardon," Alice said quickly, realizing her mistake. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." "Not like cats," cried the mouse in a shrill, passionate voice. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," Alice admitted, trying to soothe the creature. "But please don't be angry. I won't mention them again." "Not mentioned them," the mouse exclaimed, still trembling. "As if I would talk about them. My family has always hated cats, nasty, low, vulgar things. Don't let me hear the name again." "I won't, I promise," Alice said. "Shall we talk about dogs instead?" The mouse's reaction to this suggestion was, if anything, even more negative. It gave a violent shudder and swam away from Alice with renewed speed, clearly wishing to put as much distance between itself and the topic of dogs as possible. They continued to swim in silence for a while, and gradually, other creatures began to join them in the pool. First came a duck, paddling along with calm, measured strokes. Then a dodo, a large, strange, extinct-looking bird with a heavy beak. Then a lory, a small, brightly colored parrot, an eaglet, and several other curious creatures. They all swam toward the shore together, a strange and motley procession. And when they reached the bank, they climbed out and shook themselves dry, standing on the mossy ground in a dripping, bedraggled group. The question of how to get dry was the first order of business. The dodo proposed a caucus race, which involved everyone running around in a circle at their own pace, starting and stopping whenever they felt like it, for as long as they felt like it. After about half an hour of this, the dodo declared the race over and asked everyone who had won. After some thought, it was decided that everyone had won, and everyone was entitled to a prize. Alice was tasked with handing out the prizes. She rummaged in her pocket. Remarkably, her pocket was still there, even though she had changed size multiple times and found a box of comfits. She distributed them as prizes, one to each creature. And when she ran out, she gave the mouse one of her own thimbles as its prize. The animals accepted their prizes with varying degrees of gratitude. And then the mouse, still somewhat offended by Alice's earlier mention of cats, began to tell a long, dry, tedious story about its family history. It was the kind of story that went on and on and on, with no point and no end in sight. And Alice found her attention drifting. She was saved from the mouse's interminable tale by the sound of the white rabbit's voice in the distance, calling out urgently for its fan and gloves. Alice jumped up and ran toward the sound, leaving the mouse mid-sentence, and found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The rabbit was there, searching frantically through every corner. It didn't notice Alice. She was still very small, and she watched as it muttered and fussed. And then, suddenly, it pushed aside a curtain and revealed a small door that Alice hadn't seen before. The rabbit slipped through the door and was gone. Alice tried the door, but it was locked. She looked around and noticed a small bottle on a shelf. She drank from it, hoping it would make her grow. And it did. She grew rapidly, filling the room until she was once again too large to move comfortably. She could feel her foot pressing against something hard and prickly. She looked down and saw that she was crushing the rabbit's fan and gloves beneath her foot. She picked them up and held them, and as she did so, she heard a scurrying sound outside the room. The rabbit was coming back, and it was not alone. With it came a voice, a deep, gruff, commanding voice that Alice did not recognize. "There's Bill. Fetch the ladder." And a couple of them, no, half a dozen, and put them against the window. Alice's heart pounded. They were going to come through the window. She could hear the sound of ladders being erected, of feet climbing, of voices conferring. And then a small, terrified voice said, "I'm afraid I can't. I'm so frightened." "Go on, Bill. Don't be a coward," said the gruff voice. Alice could feel something small and feeble scrabbling at the window pane. She gave the window a sharp push with her foot, and whatever was on the other side fell with a yelp of surprise. There was a crash and a commotion, and then the gruff voice said, "He's fallen down the chimney. Better put the ladder against the house again." Chimney. Alice looked up and saw, to her horror, that there was a fireplace in the room, and something was coming down it. Something small and long and wriggly. It was a lizard, a little green lizard, and it was sliding down the chimney like a sausage being pushed through a tube. It tumbled out onto the hearth and lay there, dazed and breathless. "Bill," came the voices from outside. "Are you all right, Bill?" Bill lizard did not respond. He lay on the hearth, staring blankly at the ceiling, clearly in no condition to answer questions. The voices outside began to discuss what to do next. They talked about pulling the house down. They talked about sending another bill down the chimney. They talked about setting the house on fire. Alice was terrified. She shouted out the window, "You'd better not do that. I won't have it. I'll set Dinah at you." There was a dead silence from outside. And then, after a long pause, a voice said very quietly, "What was that? Did you hear something?" And another voice replied, "I think it was a mouse. Let's go and get the mouse trap." Alice's blood ran cold. She crouched in the corner of the room, clutching the rabbit's fan and gloves, listening to the sounds of the creatures outside as they discussed their plans. Small stones began to fly through the window, pattering against the walls like hail. One of them hit Alice on the forehead, and she cried out in pain and anger. "Stop that," she shouted. "I'll put Dinah on you, I will." More silence. And then nothing. The creatures seemed to have retreated. Alice waited, breathless, her heart hammering, and gradually the sounds outside faded away entirely. She was alone, safe for the moment, but still trapped in the room, still too large to fit through the door. She sat down heavily and tried to think, and then she noticed something. The fan she was holding, the fan that had made her shrink before. She dropped it at once, and sure enough, she began to diminish. She shrank rapidly, gratefully, until she was once again her normal size. And then, because she had held the fan for a few seconds too long, she continued to shrink until she was tiny again, no bigger than a few inches. She slipped out through the door and found herself in a wood. It was a strange wood, filled with unusual sounds and sights. The trees were tall and dense, their branches intertwined overhead to to form a canopy that filtered the light into a soft, greenish glow. Mushrooms of extraordinary size grew at the base of the trunks, their caps broad and spotted with vivid colors. As Alice walked through the wood, she noticed something very peculiar. Every creature she encountered, every bird, every insect, every small animal was talking. A pigeon flew overhead, muttering about serpents. A puppy bounded through the undergrowth, barking playfully, nearly crushing Alice beneath its enormous paws. She had to dodge and weave to avoid being stepped on, and the experience left her shaken. She came upon a large mushroom and stopped. Sitting on top of the mushroom, with its arms folded and its chin resting on its hands, was a caterpillar. It was a large blue caterpillar, and it was smoking a long hookah. The smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, forming shapes and patterns in the air before dissipating into the green-tinged atmosphere of the wood. Alice and the caterpillar regarded each other in silence for a long time. The caterpillar took a long, slow drag from the hookah and exhaled a thick cloud of smoke before speaking. "Who are you?" it said, in a low, languid voice that was not unfriendly, but was decidedly not welcoming either. Alice, who had been changing size so frequently that she was no longer entirely sure who she was, replied rather hesitantly, I hardly know, sir, just at present. At least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then." "What do you mean by that?" said the caterpillar sternly. "Explain yourself." "I'm afraid I can't explain myself, sir," said Alice, "because I'm not myself, you see." "I don't see," said the caterpillar. "I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly," Alice replied, with admirable patience, "for I can't understand it myself to begin with. And being so many different sizes in a single day is very confusing." "It isn't," said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet, Alice said. But when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you will someday, you know. And then, after that, into a butterfly. I should think you'll feel a little queer, won't you? Not a bit, said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps your feelings may be different, said Alice. All I know is it would feel very queer to me. You, said the caterpillar contemptuously. Who are you? The question brought Alice right back to where she had started, and she felt a flash of irritation. She drew herself up to her full height, which was not very impressive at her current size, and said, with as much dignity as she could muster, I think you ought to tell me who you are first. Why, said the caterpillar. This was a difficult question to answer. Alice couldn't think of a good reason, and the caterpillar seemed to know it. It took another drag from the hookah and said nothing for a while. Finally, the caterpillar spoke again. So you think you've changed, do you? Yes, sir, said Alice. I can't remember things as I used to, and I don't keep the same size for more than a few minutes. What size do you want to be? Asked the caterpillar. Oh, I'm not particular as to size, Alice said hastily. Only one doesn't like changing so often, you know. I don't know, said the caterpillar. Alice said nothing. She had learned by now that arguing with the creatures of this place was generally a fruitless exercise. The caterpillar unwound itself from the mushroom and descended to the ground. It crawled away for a few paces, then turned back and said, one side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter. One side of what? Alice asked. Of the mushroom, said the caterpillar. And then it moved away into the wood without another word, leaving Alice alone with the mushroom. She examined it carefully. It was a large, round mushroom, roughly the same height as Alice herself. She broke off 2 pieces, one from the right side and one from the left side, and held them in her hands. She decided to try a small bite of the right hand piece first. The effect was immediate and dramatic. She was crushed downward by an invisible force, her body shrinking so rapidly that her chin struck her foot. She managed to drop the piece of mushroom just in time, and then, in a panic, she took a bite of the left hand piece. This had the opposite effect. She shot upward, growing so fast that her head struck the branches of the trees overhead. She dropped both pieces and spent the next few minutes carefully managing her size, taking tiny nibbles from one piece and then the other, until she had reduced herself to a height of about 9 inches. A height she felt would be useful for navigating this strange world. With her size now under control, Alice set off through the wood again, and before long, she came upon a small clearing in which stood a small house. On the door of the house was a brass plate that read W. Rabbit. Alice recognized it immediately as the home of the White Rabbit. She approached the house cautiously and peered through the window. Inside, she could see the White Rabbit, still wearing its waistcoat and still holding its pocket watch, packing back and forth in a state of great agitation. On a table in the middle of the room sat a pair of kid gloves and a fan. Clearly, the very gloves and fan that Alice had been carrying. The rabbit wanted them back. There was also a voice coming from somewhere inside the house. A harsh, grating, disagreeable voice that was shouting at the rabbit. It belonged, Alice surmised, to the Duchess, for the rabbit kept saying things like, "Yes, Your Grace," and "Certainly, Your Grace," and "I'll fetch them directly, Your Grace." Alice knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again, more loudly. Still no answer. She tried the handle, and finding the door unlocked, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the house was chaotic and noisy. In the center of the room, the Duchess sat in a large armchair, holding a baby. The baby was howling. The Duchess was shaking it violently. A cook was standing over a large pot on the fire, stirring something that smelled of pepper, enormous quantities of pepper. So much pepper that the air in the room was thick with it, making Alice's eyes water and her nose tickle. There was also a cat, a large, grinning cat sitting on the hearth. It was a Cheshire cat, and it was grinning from ear to ear. A wide, slow, utterly unsettling grin that seemed to float in the air, even when the rest of the cat was obscured by the pepper-filled atmosphere. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, "why your cat grins like that?" "It's a Cheshire cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why. I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned," Alice remarked. "They all do," said the Duchess. "Most of 'em do. I don't know of any that do," Alice said, very politely. "You don't know much," said the Duchess, "and that's a fact." Alice did not care for the Duchess's tone, but before she could respond, the cook began throwing things. Dishes, pots, pans, spoons, ladles, everything within her reach was hurled across the room in every direction. The Duchess ducked and dodged, barely flinching, as though this were a perfectly normal occurrence. Alice, however, was not accustomed to having frying pans thrown at her head, and she ducked behind a chair to avoid being hit. The baby was screaming louder than ever. The Duchess, growing increasingly flustered, thrust the baby into Alice's arms and said, "Here, you may nurse it a bit if you like. I've got to go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen." And with that, she bustled out of the room, leaving Alice holding the howling infant. Alice looked down at the baby. It was a strange-looking child. Its features were oddly distorted, with a turned-up nose and small eyes that seemed to be squinting in opposite directions. As Alice watched, the baby's features seemed to shift and change, becoming more and more pig-like with each passing second. The howling, too, was changing, becoming less like a human baby's cry and more like a grunt. If it keeps growing like that, Alice thought, with a mixture of alarm and resignation, it'll turn into a pig sooner or later. I'd better take it away from here and see what happens to it. She carried the baby out of the house and into the wood. As she walked, the transformation continued. The baby's arms and legs grew shorter. Its snout became more pronounced. Its grunting became more porcine. By the time Alice had walked a few hundred yards, there was no longer any doubt about it. The baby had become a pig. A small, grunting, squealing pig. Alice set the pig down on the ground, and it trotted off into the undergrowth without a backward glance, apparently quite content with its new form. Alice watched it go with a feeling of relief. If it had grown up, she said to herself, it would have made a dreadfully ugly child. But it makes a rather handsome pig, I think. She was standing in a quiet part of the wood now. The trees were less dense here, and patches of warm light fell through the canopy onto the forest floor. And there, sitting on the branch of a tree just above her head, was the Cheshire Cat. It was still grinning. "And Cheshire Puss," said Alice, looking up at it politely. "Would you please tell me which way I ought to go from here?" "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. "So long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough." Alice felt that this was not particularly helpful advice, so she tried a different question. "What sort of people live about here?" "In that direction," the cat said, waving its right paw, "lives a hatter. And in that direction, it waved its left paw, lives a March hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad, but I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. How do you know I'm mad? Said Alice. You must be, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. Alice considered this logic and found it unassailable, if not particularly comforting. She asked one more question. Which way should I go to get to the March hare's house? The cat pointed with its right paw. That way. They have both been invited to a tea party. Thank you, said Alice. She started walking in the indicated direction, then paused and looked back. By the way, what becomes of the cat when it vanishes? You vanish very slowly, you know. In that direction, the cat said, waving its right paw, lives a hatter. And in that direction, it waved its left paw, lives a March hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad, but I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. How do you know I'm mad? Said Alice. You must be, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. Alice considered this logic and found it unassailable, if not particularly comforting. She asked one more question. Which way should I go to get to the March hare's house? The cat pointed with its right paw. That way. They have both been invited to a tea party. Thank you, said Alice. She started walking in the indicated direction, then paused and looked back. By the way, what becomes of the cat when it vanishes? You vanish very slowly, you know. First the grin, said the cat, and then the body. Goodbye. And sure enough, when Alice looked again, the grin was the last thing to fade. It lingered in the air for several seconds after the rest of the cat had disappeared, like a crescent moon hanging in the green-tinged light of the wood. Alice walked on and soon came upon a house, or rather, a very strange house. It was long and low, with a roof thatched with fur and chimneys shaped like ears. In front of the house, under a large tree, was a table set for a tea party. There were places for 3, but all 3 places were set at one end of the table, leaving the rest of the table completely empty. At the table sat the March Hare and the Hatter. Between them sat a dormouse, which was fast asleep. The March Hare and the Hatter were engaged in a heated argument when Alice approached. They were arguing about something that Alice couldn't quite follow, something about the Hatter's watch, which didn't tell the time, but instead told the day of the month. The Hatter was complaining that because it was always tea time, since time had stopped for him after he had offended it by singing badly at a concert given by the Queen of Hearts, his watch was useless. What day of the month is it? The Hatter was saying to Alice, turning to her as she approached, as though she might have the answer. The 4th, said Alice, looking at her own watch. Wrong, said the Hatter triumphantly. It's the day before yesterday. What a pity. I see, said Alice, who didn't see at all. Have some wine, the March Hare said to her, in an encouraging tone. Alice looked around the table. There was no wine. I don't see any wine, she observed. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Then it wasn't very polite of you to offer it, said Alice. It wasn't very polite of you to sit down without being invited, said the March Hare. I didn't know it was your table, said Alice. It's laid for a great many more than 3. The March Hare and the Hatter looked at each other, and then at the empty places at the table, and said nothing. Your hair wants cutting, said the Hatter, eyeing Alice critically. You should learn not to make personal remarks, Alice said, with some severity. It's very rude. The Hatter opened his eyes very wide at this, but all he said was, Why is a raven like a writing desk? This was a riddle that Alice had never heard before. She thought about it for a long time, turning it over in her mind, but she could not come up with an answer. "I give up," she said at last. "What's the answer?" "I haven't the faintest idea," said the Hatter. "Nor I," said the March Hare. Alice sighed in exasperation. This was not going well. The Dormouse, who had been asleep throughout this exchange, suddenly opened one eye and said in a sleepy voice, "You should say what you mean." "I do," Alice hastily replied. At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "Not the same thing a bit," said the Hatter. "Why, you might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say," added the March Hare, "that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might just as well say," the Dormouse added, who seemed to be talking in its sleep, "that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe." "It is the same thing with you," said the Hatter, and the conversation dissolved into nonsense from that point onward. Alice grew more and more frustrated with the Hatter and the March Hare. They spoke in riddles and contradictions. They made no sense, and they were thoroughly, maddeningly rude. After enduring as much as she could, she stood up from the table in disgust. "It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in all my life," she declared, and walked away. The Hatter and the March Hare made no move to stop her. In fact, the Hatter didn't even look up as she left. He was busy buttering a slice of bread. Buttering the bread, not the bread being buttered, but the other way around, as though the distinction mattered enormously. The March Hare was dunking a watch into its teacup. The Dormouse had fallen back asleep. Alice walked on through the wood, and before long she came upon a large tree with a door in it. The door was about 3 feet high. She used her mushroom pieces to adjust her size until she was the right height. And then she opened the door and stepped through. She found herself in a long, low hall, not unlike the first hall she had found herself in after falling down the rabbit hole, but different in its details. At the far end of the hall was a beautiful garden, bathed in golden light. But this time, there was no locked door standing between Alice and the garden. This time, she could walk right in. And what a garden it was! It was the most extraordinary garden Alice had ever seen or could ever have imagined. The flower beds were filled with flowers of impossible colors and impossible sizes. Roses that were taller than Alice glowed in shades of deep crimson and gold. Pansies, the size of dinner plates, turned their faces toward the light, their petals painted in patterns that looked almost like faces. Tulips stood in neat rows, their cups filled not with stamens and pistils, but with what appeared to be tiny, delicate sculptures made of sugar. The grass was a vivid, unreal green, and the gravel paths that wound through the garden were made of smooth, polished stones in shades of blue and silver. But there was something else in this garden, something that made Alice stop and stare. There were card soldiers playing cards, walking around on their flat, rectangular bodies, their arms and legs sticking out at odd angles. They were painting the roses. 3 of them were diligently applying red paint to a white rose bush, their brushes moving in quick, nervous strokes. "Why are you painting those roses red?" Alice asked, approaching the soldiers. The soldiers looked up, startled. One of them, who appeared to be the leader, the 2 of spades, said in a hushed and anxious voice, "You see, miss, the fact is, we planted a white rose tree by mistake. And if the Queen finds out, she'll have our heads cut off. So we're painting them red before she comes." Alice thought this was a remarkably poor solution to a remarkably simple problem. But before she could say so, a procession came around the corner of the garden path. It was a magnificent, elaborate procession, the likes of which Alice had never seen. At the head of the procession marched a number of card soldiers, 10 soldiers carrying clubs, followed by 10 courtiers adorned with diamonds, followed by 10 royal children decorated with hearts. After the children came the guests, various kings and queens and dukes and duchesses, all of them playing cards, all of them walking 2 by 2. Then came the Knave of Hearts, carrying the royal crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And then, finally, came the King and Queen of Hearts themselves. The Queen of Hearts was a formidable sight. She was a large woman, larger than any of the other cards, and she wore a gown of deep red and gold, with a crown of jewels perched precariously on her head. Her face was red and flushed, and her expression was one of perpetual fury, as though the entire world had personally offended her, and she was only just barely containing her rage. The King of Hearts, by contrast, was a small, mild, nervous-looking man who scurried along beside his wife like a mouse in the shadow of a cat. Off with their heads, the Queen was shouting, even before the procession had fully come into view. Off with their heads, off with... As she stopped, she had seen the white rose bush, or rather, she had seen the half-painted rose bush, its blooms a mottled mess of white and red, the paint still wet and dripping. Her eyes went wide. Her face, already red, turned a shade darker. "Who's been painting my roses?" she demanded, her voice like thunder. The 3 of spades threw itself to the ground. "Your Majesty, it was we planted white roses by mistake, and we were trying to." Off with their heads, the Queen shrieked. "Wouldn't that be a waste?" said Alice, stepping forward before she could stop herself. "They've only just finished painting them, and And if you cut their heads off, there'll be no one left to do the rest of the garden. The queen turned her furious gaze on Alice. For a long, terrible moment, Alice thought she had made a dreadful mistake. But then the queen's expression shifted, not softened exactly, but shifted into something that might, at a stretch, have been grudging approval. Who is this?" the queen said to the king. "An invited guest, your majesty," said the king, reading from a list on a scroll. "Invited or not, I like her," said the queen. "Come along, child, and join the croquet game." The croquet game was unlike any croquet game Alice had ever seen or heard of. The balls were live hedgehogs, rolled across the ground by the players. The mallets were live flamingos, held by their legs and swung with great difficulty, as the flamingos had a tendency to twist their necks around and look at the player with expressions of profound indignation. The arches were made of card soldiers who bent and straightened themselves at the player's command, though not always at the right times or in the right ways. Alice was given a flamingo and a hedgehog and told to take her place. She found the flamingo extremely uncooperative. Every time she raised it to swing, it would twist its long neck and look at her with one round, disapproving eye, as though to say, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The hedgehog, for its part, kept unrolling itself and toddling away in a different direction from the one Alice intended. The game was chaos, pure, unbridled chaos. No one could keep score. The rules seemed to change from moment to moment. Players argued, hedgehogs escaped, flamingos flapped, and card soldiers kept falling over. And through it all, the Queen of Hearts stormed around the ground, shouting off with their heads at anyone who displeased her, which was nearly everyone. Off with her head. The queen shouted at a player who had accidentally sent their hedgehog through the wrong arch. "Nonsense," said Alice, who was beginning to find the queen's constant threats rather tiresome. The queen turned on her, eyes blazing. "Hold your tongue." "I won't," said Alice, with surprising boldness. "Off with her head," the queen screamed. The king placed a hand on the queen's arm. "Consider, my dear, she's only a child." The queen glared at the king, then at Alice, and then, with a visible effort, turned away and resumed the game. Alice was left with her heart pounding and her hands trembling. But she had stood up to the Queen of Hearts and survived. She felt a small, warm spark of pride. The game was interrupted by the appearance of the Cheshire Cat, which materialized slowly in the branches of a nearby tree, beginning with its grin and then filling in the rest of its body from the top down. The queen was not pleased to see it. "Who are you talking to?" she demanded of the king, who was looking up at the cat. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat," said the king. "Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it," said the queen. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." The Cheshire Cat declined this honor, and the queen, outraged, ordered its execution. This presented a problem, as the executioner argued that you can't cut off a head that isn't attached to a body. The king argued that anything that has a head can be beheaded, and the cat itself simply sat in the tree and grinned, apparently finding the entire debate highly entertaining. While the queen, the king, and the executioner argued, Alice slipped away from the croquet ground and found herself wandering through the garden once more. She came upon a doorway in a tree and passed through it into a part of the garden she hadn't seen before. Here, she found the Duchess sitting on a stool and nursing the same baby, though the baby was no longer a baby, of course, and the Duchess didn't seem to notice. The Duchess was in a more reflective mood than she had been in the kitchen. She spoke to Alice about morals and about finding lessons in everything. Everything's got a moral, "If only you can find it," she said, and then proceeded to find morals in the most unlikely places. When Alice sneezed, the Duchess said, "You know the moral of that. Don't sneeze. People who sneeze get into trouble." Alice found the Duchess's company even less agreeable than before, and was relieved when the Queen appeared and sent the Duchess away with a curt "off with her head," a command that, for once, was not carried out. The Queen then turned to Alice and said with grim enthusiasm, "Have you seen the Mock Turtle?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "Then come and see it," said the Queen. Alice was led to a secluded part of the garden where the Mock Turtle was sitting on a rock, alone and looking profoundly miserable. It was a strange creature. It had the body of a turtle, but its head, arms, and legs were those of a calf. It was weeping copiously, great tears rolling down its cheeks and splashing onto the rock. "This here young lady," said the Queen, indicating Alice, "wants to know your history." The Mock Turtle sniffed and began its story. It told Alice about its education at the bottom of the sea, where it had been taught by an old turtle called Tortoise. "We called him Tortoise because he taught us," the Mock Turtle explained, though Alice failed to see the connection. It had studied reeling and writhing, and ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. It had taken lessons in mystery, ancient and modern, with seaography and drawing. The different branches of arithmetic included ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. The Mock Turtle's story was long, meandering, and utterly confusing, but Alice listened politely, nodding at what she hoped were the appropriate moments. When the Mock Turtle finished, it was joined by a griffon, a large, fearsome creature with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. The griffon was boisterous and rough, but it seemed to mean well, and it took Alice under its wing quite literally. "Come on," said the Griffon. "Let's hear some of her songs." The mock turtle sighed heavily and began to sing. It sang a song called Turtle Soup, which was a melancholy, mournful ballad about a beautiful soup that you could never eat, because once you'd eaten it, it was gone. The song was so sad that Alice felt tears pricking at her own eyes, even though she didn't fully understand what the turtle was singing about. Then suddenly, the Griffon grabbed Alice's hand. "Hurry up," it said. "The trial's about to start." "A trial," said Alice. "What trial?" "The trial of the Knave of Hearts," said the Griffon. "He's accused of stealing the Queen's tarts. Come on." They ran through the garden, the Griffon's powerful legs covering the ground in great strides, Alice trotting beside it, her heart beating fast. They arrived at a courtyard where a large crowd had gathered. In the center of the courtyard was a table, and at the table sat the King and Queen of Hearts, attended by a jury box filled with various creatures, birds and animals and insects, all of them writing busily on slates. The Knave of Hearts stood before the King and Queen in chains, looking pale and frightened. He was accused of stealing a plate of tarts that the Queen had baked. The trial was a farce from beginning to end. The King, who was acting as judge, wore a wig over his crown and looked utterly ridiculous. The jury wrote down everything that was said, whether it was relevant or not. The first witness called was the Hatter, who arrived still wearing his hat and looking thoroughly confused. He was asked what he knew about the stolen tarts and replied that he knew nothing. He was then asked to read a verse that had been found in his pocket. And the verse, when read aloud, seemed to suggest that the knave was guilty, though it was so full of nonsense and contradictions that it could have meant almost anything. The Hatter was dismissed, and the next witness was called the cook. refused to give any evidence and simply said pepper. Every time she was asked a question, the Duchess, who was sitting nearby, was called to identify the cook, but she simply said, "You're all thinking about something, and that makes you forget to talk." And then the Queen called Alice to the stand. Alice stepped forward, still not entirely sure how she had become a witness. The King held up a piece of paper and said, "Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court." "I'm not a mile high," said Alice indignantly. "You are," said the King. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the Queen. "Well, I shan't go at any rate," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now. It's the oldest rule in the book," said the King. "Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The King turned pale and closed his notebook. He looked at the jury and said in a trembling voice, "Consider your verdict." "No, no," said the Queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." "Stuff and nonsense," said Alice. Off with her head. The Queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. The card soldiers, the jury, the witnesses, they all stood perfectly still, looking at Alice. Even the Griffon, who had brought her here, made no move to help or hinder. Alice felt a surge of something rising within her, a powerful, defiant, almost reckless feeling, like a wave cresting before it breaks. "You're nothing but a pack of cards," she cried, and she flung herself at them. And then everything went dark. The cards rose up around her like a great, fluttering storm of red and black and white, filling the air, filling her vision, filling the world. They fluttered and swirled and spun, and Alice felt herself falling or flying or both through a whirlwind of color and sound and sensation. She threw out her hands to push them away, and the cards were soft under her fingers, not paper at all, but something softer, something dry and brittle and familiar. The leaves, they were dry leaves, dead, brown autumn leaves. Alice opened her eyes. She was lying on the river bank. The warm afternoon sun was still shining, still golden, still lazy. The willow trees still trailed their branches in the water. The river still murmured its quiet song. The dragonflies still darted and hovered. The air still smelled of clover and chamomile. Her sister was sitting beside her, still reading the book without pictures. Alice sat up slowly. Her head felt strange, fuzzy, and thick, as though she were waking from a very deep sleep. She looked around her, half expecting to see a white rabbit in a waistcoat, or a Cheshire cat grinning from a branch, or a flamingo tucked under her arm. But there was nothing. Just the river, the grass, the sky, and her sister reading. Had it all been a dream? The rabbit hole, the hall of doors, the mushroom, the caterpillar, the tea party, the Queen of Hearts, the trial. Had none of it been real? Alice looked down at her hands. They were her own hands, normal-sized, clean, unmarked. She touched her hair. It was as it always was. She felt her own face, her own shoulders, her own body. Everything was as it should be. But the dream, if it was a dream, had been so vivid, so real, so richly detailed, that it seemed impossible, that it could have been nothing more than the invention of a sleeping mind. The feel of the cool air as she fell down the rabbit hole, the taste of the drink-me bottle, the sound of the Cheshire cat's voice, the heat of the Queen's fury, the sadness of the mock turtle's song. All of it was still with her, pressed into her memory like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. Alice, Alice, wake up, dear. Her sister was saying, gently shaking her shoulder. You've been asleep a long time. It's time to go home. Alice blinked and smiled. She got to her feet, brushing the dry leaves from her dress, and took her sister's hand. As they walked home together through the golden afternoon, Alice was quiet for a while, lost in thought, and then she spoke. "I had such a curious dream," she said, and she began to tell her sister all about it. About the white rabbit and the little door and the beautiful garden. About the caterpillar and the Cheshire cat and the mad tea party. About the Queen of Hearts and the trial and the pack of cards that turned into falling leaves. Her sister listened with a gentle smile, and when Alice finished, she kissed her on the forehead and said, "It was a curious dream indeed, my dear. But now it's time to forget it and think about more sensible things." But Alice could not forget it. Not entirely. And even as she ate her dinner that evening and went through her bedtime routine and climbed into her comfortable bed and closed her eyes, the images of her dream lingered at the edges of her mind. Soft, golden, impossible images that would stay with her for the rest of her life, shimmering like the surface of the river on a summer afternoon, always just out of reach, always just beyond the edge of waking. And deep in the ground, far beneath the riverbank where Alice had sat, in a place that may or may not have existed, a white rabbit in a waistcoat checked its pocket watch, muttered, "Oh dear, oh dear, I shall be late," and hurried on its way forever and always through the strange and wonderful world that lived in the space between sleeping and waking, between the real and the imagined, between the story and the dream. And the river murmured on, and the sun set, and the stars came out one by one, like tiny lanterns being lit in a vast and darkening sky. And the world grew quiet and still and peaceful, and Alice slept. Alice slept, but her sleep was not the deep, blank, dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted. It was something gentler than that, something more layered and textured, like the surface of a pond that has been stirred by a breeze and is slowly, gradually settling back into stillness. Her body was still. Her breathing was slow and even. Her hands lay open at her sides, palms up, fingers slightly curled, as though she were waiting to receive something. Her face, in the dim light of the bedroom, was peaceful. The small furrow between her brows that had appeared during the telling of her dream had smoothed away, and her lips were parted just slightly, as though she were about to speak, but had thought better of it. Outside her window, the night deepened. The moon rose, a full, heavy, silver moon that hung low over the English countryside like a lantern left burning by a careless angel. It cast long, cool shadows across the garden and the fields beyond, turning everything it touched to silver and shadow. An owl called from somewhere in the dark woods, its voice low and mournful and strangely comforting, like the sound of a cello playing a single, sustained note in an empty room. A nightingale, hidden in the hedge near the garden gate, began to sing. A song so beautiful and so intricate that it seemed almost impossible that such a sound could come from so small a creature. It wove melody upon melody, phrase upon phrase, each one more lovely than the last. And then it would pause, as though holding its breath, and begin again from a different direction, taking the listener down a new and unexpected path. And Alice, in her bed, in her sleep, heard it, or thought she heard it, or dreamed that she heard it. The distinction at that particular moment was not particularly important, for the dream was coming back, not in the sudden, violent way it had come before, not the sharp, startling plummet down the rabbit hole, not the disorienting rush of falling. This time, the dream arrived gently, like a tide creeping in over a flat beach, the water advancing inch by inch, so slowly and so quietly that you might not notice it until you looked down and saw that the sand beneath your feet was already wet. Alice found herself standing in a meadow. It was not the river bank from the afternoon, nor was it any meadow she recognized from her waking life. It was wider than any meadow had a right to be, stretching away in every direction to a horizon that seemed impossibly distant, as though the world itself had been unrolled like a carpet and laid flat. The grass was long and soft, swaying in a breeze that Alice could feel on her skin, but could not see. The grass moved, the flowers nodded, but the air itself was still, as though the wind were coming from somewhere deep underground, rising up through the soil and the roots of the grass, and carrying with it a scent that was unlike anything Alice had ever smelled before. It was the scent of night-blooming flowers, jasmine and honeysuckle and moonflower. But it was also something else, something older and stranger, something that did not belong to any world Alice had ever known. The sky above the meadow was not the sky she was used to. It was a deep, rich violet, darker than any twilight sky she had seen, and it was filled with stars, not the scattered, pinprick stars of an English night, but enormous, close, luminous stars that seemed to hang just above the horizon like ripe fruit waiting to be picked. They pulsed gently, each one emitting a soft, warm light that was different in color from its neighbors. Some gold, some silver, some a pale, ethereal blue. And the combined effect was of a sky that was not just a ceiling, but a living thing, a vast and breathing canopy of light. Alice stood in the center of this meadow and breathed deeply, and the air filled her lungs like cool water, and she felt a sense of peace settle over her that was so complete, so total, that it was almost indistinguishable from the peace of not existing at all. She was not happy exactly. She was not sad. She was not excited or afraid or curious. She was simply present. She was there in that meadow, under that sky, and for a long, suspended moment, that was enough. But Alice was Alice, and Alice could not remain at peace for long without her curiosity beginning to stir. It was like a small animal waking up from a nap. First, a twitch of the nose, then a stretch, then a cautious opening of the eyes, and then an urgent, irrepressible need to explore. She looked around the meadow and noticed for the first time that there was a path. It wound through the tall grass like a ribbon, a narrow trail of bare earth that curved and meandered in a way that suggested it had not been made by any human hand, but had simply grown there, like a river finding its way to the sea. Alice followed it. The path led her through the meadow and into a wood. The trees here were unlike any trees she had seen in her dream before. They were tall and slender, with silver white bark and leaves that were a deep, shimmering blue, like the leaves of a dream painted by an artist who had never seen a real tree, but had only heard them described. The light that filtered through these blue leaves was blue as well, a soft, cool, underwater blue that made Alice feel as though she were walking through the interior of an enormous sapphire. The path continued, winding between the trees, and as Alice walked, she began to notice sounds. Not alarming sounds, not the shouting of the Queen of Hearts, or the anxious chatter of the white rabbit, but softer sounds, gentler sounds, the kind of sounds that might be heard in a place where nothing dangerous or urgent ever happened. There was the sound of water running somewhere nearby, a gentle, bubbling sound, like a brook talking to itself as it tumbled over smooth stones. There was the sound of leaves rustling, though there was no wind. There was the sound of something that might have been music, a faint, distant melody, so soft that Alice could not tell whether she was actually hearing it or merely imagining it. And then, between one step and the next, the wood opened up, and Alice found herself in another garden. But this was not the Queen of Hearts' garden, with its painted roses and carved soldiers and constant threats of execution. This garden was different. This garden was quiet. It was a circular garden, enclosed by a low hedge of dark green boxwood that was clipped into geometric shapes, spirals and cones and pyramids, all perfectly formed and perfectly still, as though they had been carved from stone rather than grown from living wood. At the center of the garden was a fountain, and the fountain was unlike any fountain Alice had ever seen. It did not spray water upward in the usual way. Instead, the water emerged from the top of the fountain in a slow, languid spiral, like the thread of a screw, coiling downward in a smooth, unbroken curve until it reached the basin at the bottom, where it was collected and sent back up to the top again. The effect was mesmerizing. A continuous, flowing ribbon of water that never broke, never splashed, never hurried. It simply moved with the patience and grace of something that had all the time in the world. Around the fountain, arranged in concentric circles on the grass, were flowers. But these were not ordinary flowers. These were flowers that glowed. Each one emitted a soft, warm light from within its petals. Roses that glowed amber, lilies that glowed white gold, violets that glowed a deep, rich purple, tulips that glowed in shades of coral and peach and rose. The light they gave off was not harsh or bright. It was the light of a candle seen through a veil, or the light of the moon reflected in still water. It was a light that seemed to exist not to illuminate, but to comfort, to wrap the garden in a gentle, luminous warmth that made Alice feel as though she were standing inside a living jewel. She stood at the edge of the garden, looking in, and for a long time she did not move. She simply stood and looked and breathed, and the glow of the flowers washed over her like a warm bath, and the sound of the spiral fountain filled her ears like a lullaby. And then she heard a voice. Not many find their way here. The voice was soft and low and unhurried, like the voice of someone who has learned through long practice that there is no point in rushing speech, because there is no point in rushing anything. It came from somewhere to Alice's left, and she turned to see who had spoken. Sitting on a stone bench at the far side of the garden, half hidden in shadow, was a figure. It was not, at first glance, a remarkable figure. It appeared to be an old woman, wrapped in a dark cloak, with a face that was lined and weathered, but not unkind. But as Alice looked more closely, she noticed that the woman's eyes were unusual. They were very large and very dark, and they reflected the light of the glowing flowers in a way that made them seem to contain tiny, swirling galaxies, points of light that moved and shifted and pulsed, as though the woman's eyes were not eyes at all, but windows into some vast and distant cosmos. "What is this place?" Alice asked, stepping into the garden. Her voice sounded small and quiet in the stillness, but it did not seem out of place. Everything here was small and quiet. "It has many names," the woman said. "Some call it the Garden of Lost Things. Some call it the Garden of Almost Remembered Dreams. Some call it the In-Between." She paused, and the tiny galaxies in her eyes shifted and swirled. "I simply call it the garden. It's beautiful," Alice said, and she meant it. She had never seen anything so beautiful in all her life, not in her waking life, and not even in her dream. "Yes," the woman agreed. "It is." She said it without pride, without ownership, simply as one might acknowledge an obvious truth. The sky is blue. Water is wet. The garden is beautiful. Alice walked further into the garden, drawn by the gentle pull of the glowing flowers and the mesmerizing spiral of the fountain. She passed close to a cluster of roses that glowed with a deep amber light, and as she did, she noticed something. The light from the roses was not steady. It was pulsing slowly, gently, rhythmically, the rhythm was the rhythm of a heartbeat. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump, pause. Each pulse of light was a heartbeat. And as Alice stood among the roses, she felt her own heartbeat begin to synchronize with theirs, until she could not tell whether the rhythm she was hearing was the rhythm of the roses or the rhythm of her own chest. That happens to everyone who stays long enough, the woman said, as though reading Alice's thoughts. The garden has a heartbeat. In time, your heart learns to beat in time with it. Is that a good thing? Alice asked. It is not a good thing or a bad thing, the woman said. It is simply what happens. Alice moved on past the roses and toward a bed of lilies. These glowed with a cooler light, a silvery white light that was almost lunar in its quality. As she approached them, she noticed that each lily had a single drop of water resting on its petals, and in each drop of water there was a reflection. But the reflections were not of the garden or the sky or Alice herself. The reflections were of other places, other gardens, other skis, other worlds. In one drop, Alice saw a city of white marble, its towers gleaming under a sky with 3 suns. In another, she saw an ocean of liquid silver, its surface perfectly still, reflecting a sky full of shooting stars. In a third, she saw a forest of crystal trees, their branches ringing softly in a wind that Alice could almost hear. What are those? She whispered, leaning close to the lilies. Other dreams, the woman said. Other dreamers. The lilies catch the light of dreams that are being dreamed in other places by other people in other worlds. Every sleeping mind is a garden, and every garden has its light, and the lilies here are collectors. They gather the light of other gardens and hold it for a moment in their petals. Alice stared at the reflections, fascinated. Somewhere, right now, someone was dreaming of a city of white marble. Somewhere, someone was dreaming of a silver ocean. Somewhere, someone was dreaming of crystal trees. And here, in this garden, the light of those dreams was being held like a precious thing, like a secret being kept safe until it was needed again. "Can I touch them?" Alice asked. "You can," the woman said, "but be gentle. Dreams are more fragile than they appear." Alice reached out and touched the surface of one of the water drops with the tip of her finger. The moment she did, a wave of sensation passed through her. Not a physical sensation exactly, but something deeper, something that touched a part of her that she did not have a name for. She saw, for just an instant, a flash of the city of white marble, not as a reflection, but as though she were standing in it, feeling its warm stone beneath her feet and its triple sunlight on her face. She heard the distant sound of bells and the murmur of voices speaking a language she did not know, but somehow understood. And she smelled the scent of spices, cinnamon and saffron, and something else, something she had never smelled before and would never smell again. And then the sensation faded, and she was back in the garden, standing among the glowing lilies, her finger still resting on the water drop. The reflection in the drop had changed. It now showed a different scene, a different dream, a different world. Every time you touch a drop, you see a different dream, the woman said. No two touches are ever the same. The dreams are always changing, always flowing, always becoming something new. Alice moved away from the lilies, her mind full of wonder, and continued her slow exploration of the garden. She came upon a bed of violets that glowed with such a deep, rich purple that they seemed to be made of velvet lit from within. Their scent was extraordinary, not the ordinary scent of violets, but something richer and more complex, a scent that contained within it every violet that had ever bloomed, every violet that had ever been picked and pressed between the pages of a book, every violet that had ever been given as a gift or worn in a buttonhole, or simply admired in passing by someone walking through a garden on a spring afternoon. Near the violets, she found a sundial. But this was no ordinary sundial. The dial was made of a dark, polished stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And the gnomon, the shadow-casting piece, was not a straight spike, but a curved, flowing shape, like a flame or a wave or the neck of a swan. The numbers around the edge of the dial were not the usual hours of the day. Instead, they were words. Alice leaned close and read them. Once, sometimes, always, never, almost, perhaps, again. There was no shadow on the sundial. The gnomon cast no shadow despite the light of the glowing flowers. The dial was blank, without indication, as though it were waiting for something, or as though it measured something that could not be measured by shadows. "It doesn't tell time," the woman said from her bench. "It tells something else." "What does it tell?" Alice asked. "Different things to different people," the woman said. "What does it tell you?" Alice looked at the sundial again. She looked at the words once, sometimes, always, never, almost, perhaps, again. And she felt something stir within her, something that was not quite a thought and not quite a feeling, but something in between, something that existed in the same liminal space as the garden itself. "It tells me that I've been here before," Alice said, and the moment she said it, she knew it was true, not in the literal sense, not in the sense that she had physically walked in this garden at some earlier time, but in a deeper sense, a sense that she could not explain, but could not deny. She had been here before. In her dreams, perhaps. In the dreams she had forgotten upon waking. The dreams that dissolved like mist in the morning light, leaving behind only a residue of feeling, a lingering warmth, a faint sadness, a sense of having touched something beautiful and then lost it. This garden was the place those feelings came from. This garden was the source. Everyone has been here before, the woman said. Everyone who has ever dreamed has passed through this garden, if only for a moment. Most do not remember. The garden does not mind. It is patient. It will be here when they come again. Alice sat down on the grass beside the sundial. The grass was soft and cool, and it seemed to welcome her weight, molding itself around her like a cushion. She looked up at the sky, that deep violet sky with its enormous pulsing stars, and she felt, for the second time since entering this garden, that complete and total peace she had felt upon first arriving. But this time, the peace was deeper. This time, it was not the peace of emptiness, but the peace of fullness, the peace of a cup that has been filled to the brim and is simply resting, content to hold what it has been given without needing more. "Can I stay here?" she asked. "You can stay as long as you like," the woman said. "The garden does not close. It does not have hours. It does not have a gate with a lock. You may leave whenever you wish, and you may return whenever you wish. The garden will be here." Alice closed her eyes. The light of the flowers still reached her through her closed eyelids, a warm amber glow, like sunlight filtered through honey. The sound of the fountain still reached her ears, that continuous, unbroken spiral of water, flowing and flowing and flowing, never hurrying, never stopping. The scent of the flowers still filled her nose. Roses and lilies and violets, layer upon layer upon layer. A perfume so complex and so beautiful that it was almost too much to bear. Like a piece of music so lovely that it makes you want to cry. She sat there for what felt like a very long time. Time in this garden did not behave as it did in the world above. It did not march forward in its usual relentless way, tick by tick, second by second. Here, time moved like the water in the fountain, slowly, spirally, in great, lazy curves that doubled back on themselves and looped around and seemed to go nowhere and everywhere at once. Alice had no idea how long she sat on the grass with her eyes closed. It might have been minutes. It might have been hours. It might have been years. In the garden of lost things, such distinctions were not particularly meaningful. When she opened her eyes again, the woman was standing beside her. Alice had not heard her approach. She had simply appeared the way things appear in dreams, without transition or explanation, as though they had always been there, and you had only just noticed them. "Come," the woman said, and she held out her hand. It was a small hand, wrinkled and weathered, but there was a strength in it that Alice found reassuring. Alice took the woman's hand and stood up. The woman led her slowly and gently through the garden, past the glowing roses and the reflective lilies and the scented violets and the silent sundial, past beds of flowers that Alice had not noticed before, flowers that glowed with colors she did not have names for, colors that existed only in this garden and nowhere else in the universe, colors that were so beautiful that looking at them was like looking at the edge of the world and seeing for the first time what lay beyond it. They came to the far edge of the garden, where the boxwood hedge ended and the blue-leafed wood began again. But here, in the gap between the hedge and the trees, there was something new. A gate. It was a small gate, made of iron worked into delicate, intricate patterns, patterns that looked, at first glance, like ordinary decorative scrollwork, but which, when Alice looked more closely, revealed themselves to be tiny scenes. A rabbit running, a cat grinning, a teacup steaming, a crown glinting, a heart bleeding, a flame dancing, a tear falling, a star exploding. Every scene was a moment from her dream. her first dream, the one she had told her sister about, captured in iron and frozen in time. "What's beyond the gate?" Alice asked. "Another garden," the woman said, "and beyond that another, and beyond that another. The gardens go on forever. Every dream that has ever been dreamed has its garden, and every garden is connected to every other garden by a path, and the paths go on and on and on, and there is no end to them, and there is no beginning, and there is no center, and there is no edge. They simply are." "Will I remember this?" Alice asked. "When I wake up?" The woman looked at her with those deep, galaxy-filled eyes, and for a long time she said nothing. Then she smiled, a small, gentle smile that was both sad and happy, the way a smile might look on the face of someone who knows a beautiful secret but cannot tell it. "You will remember that there was something to remember," the woman said. "That is enough. That is always enough." Alice looked at the gate. She looked at the intricate iron scenes, at the tiny captured moments from her dream. She looked at the path beyond the gate, winding away into the blue-leafed wood toward gardens she could not see, and dreams she had not yet dreamed. And she felt, rising within her, a longing so deep and so sweet that it was almost painful. A longing not for anything specific, but for the act of longing itself, for the feeling of reaching toward something beautiful that was just beyond the reach of her outstretched fingers. "But I have to go back, don't I?" she said. It was not really a question. "You have to go back," the woman agreed. "But you will come again. You come every night. You simply do not remember." Alice felt a wave of sadness wash over her, a gentle, quiet sadness, like the sadness of saying goodbye to a friend at the end of a visit, knowing that you will see them again, but also knowing that the time between now and then will feel very long. She looked at the woman one last time, at her weathered face and her galaxy eyes, and her gentle, patient smile. And she wanted to say something meaningful, something that would capture what she was feeling in that moment. But the words would not come. There were no words for what she was feeling. There were no words for the garden of lost things. There were no words for the space between sleeping and waking, between the real and the imagined, between the story and the dream. So she simply nodded, and the woman nodded back, and Alice turned away from the gate and walked back through the garden, past the sundial that did not tell time, past the violets that smelled of every violet that had ever bloomed, past the lilies that held the light of other dreamers' dreams, past the roses that beat with the heartbeat of the garden itself, past the fountain with its slow, spiraling ribbon of water that never broke and never hurried. And she came to the edge of the garden where the meadow began. And she stepped out of the garden and into the meadow, and the grass was soft under her feet, and the violet sky stretched away above her, and the enormous stars pulsed their warm, gentle light. And she felt the peace of the garden begin to loosen its hold on her, like fingers slowly releasing a hand they had been holding. She walked across the meadow. The path was still there, winding through the tall grass, and she followed it. And as she walked, the meadow began to change. The grass grew shorter. The stars grew smaller. The violet sky began to light, to pale, to shift from violet to indigo to deep blue to the soft, gray blue of pre-dawn. The scent of night-blooming flowers faded, replaced by the scent of morning, dew on grass, and cool earth, and the first faint hint of wood smoke from a chimney somewhere in the waking world. Alice kept walking. The path grew narrower and narrower until it was barely wider than her foot, and then it was gone entirely, and she was walking on bare ground. And then the ground itself began to thin and fade, becoming translucent, becoming transparent, becoming nothing. And Alice was walking on nothing, through nothing, toward nothing. And the was not frightening, but was simply the absence of something. The way the space between one breath and the next is simply the absence of air, and it is natural, and it is right, and it is the way things are. And then there was a moment, a single, suspended, crystalline moment, when Alice was neither here nor there, neither asleep nor awake, neither in the dream nor in the waking world, but in the space between, that thin, gossamer membrane that separates the world of the imagination from the world of the everyday. And in that moment, she heard something. It was a sound so faint and so far away that she might have imagined it a voice calling her name. Alice, Alice, it's time to wake up. And the membrane broke gently, like the surface of a pond, when a single drop of water falls into it, and the ripples spread outward, and the dream dissolved, and Alice opened her eyes. Morning light was streaming through her bedroom window. The curtains were drawn back. Someone had drawn them back while she slept, and the room was filled with a warm, golden glow that was different from the golden glow of the garden, but was beautiful in its own way. Birds were singing outside, not nightingales, just ordinary English birds, sparrows and thrushes and blackbirds. But their songs were pretty nonetheless, and Alice lay in her bed and listened to them for a while before she moved. She lay there and tried to hold on to the dream. She clutched at it the way you clutch at a strand of spider silk that is floating away on a breeze, gently, carefully, because you know that if you grip too tightly, it will break. She tried to remember the meadow, the violet sky, the blue-leafed wood, the garden with its glowing flowers, and its spiral fountain, and its silent sundial. She tried to remember the woman with the galaxy eyes. She tried to remember the gate with its iron scenes, and the path beyond the gate that led to other gardens, other dreams, other worlds without end. Some of it stayed with her. The feeling of the garden, that deep, complete, impossible peace, stayed with her, lodged in her chest like a warm stone. The image of the fountain, with its slow, unbroken spiral of water, stayed with her, moving in the back of her mind like a gentle current. The scent of the flowers, roses and lilies and violets, layered and complex and beautiful, stayed with her. A ghost of a perfume that she could almost smell when she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. But the details faded. They always did. The woman's face became blurry, then formless, then gone. The words on the sundial, once, sometimes, always, never, almost, perhaps, again, slipped away one by one, like beads falling off a broken string. The reflections in the lily drops, the city of white marble, the silver ocean, the crystal forest, dissolved into nothing, leaving behind only the memory that there had been something beautiful and that she had seen it, and that it had made her feel something she could not name. Alice got out of bed. She went through her morning routine, washing her face, combing her hair, dressing for the day. And as she did, she moved in a gentle, unhurried way that was unusual for her. She was usually a brisk, energetic child, prone to rushing through her morning tasks so that she could get outside and play. But this morning, she was slow. This morning, she moved like someone who is carrying something fragile and does not want to drop it. Not because the thing itself is breakable, but because the act of carrying it carefully is a way of honoring it, of saying without words, "This matters to me. I will not treat it carelessly." At breakfast, her mother noticed that Alice was quieter than usual. "Are you feeling all right, dear?" she asked, pouring tea into Alice's cup. "I had a dream," Alice said. "A very long dream." "Another one," her sister said from across the table with a knowing smile. "You and your dreams." "This one was different," Alice said. She paused, trying to find the right words, and then said simply, "It was peaceful." Her mother and sister exchanged a glance, but said nothing more. They had learned over the years that Alice's inner life was a rich and complex territory that did not always yield to explanation. After breakfast, Alice went outside. It was a beautiful morning, clear and cool, with a sky that was a pale, washed-out blue, as though the night's rain had washed away all the deeper colors and left only the gentlest, softest shade behind. The garden was bright with dew. The roses were open, their petals heavy with moisture, and the sunlight caught the droplets and turned them into tiny prisms that threw little rainbows onto the leaves below. Alice walked through the garden and came to the sundial. It was an ordinary sundial, the one that stood at the center of the family's garden, the one that had been there for as long as Alice could remember. It had a straight gnomon and numbered hours, and it cast a proper shadow that pointed to the correct time. It was nothing like the sundial in her dream, but Alice stood before it for a long time, looking at it, and in her mind's eye, she saw, superimposed over the ordinary sundial like a double exposure in a photograph, the dream sundial with its dark stone and its curved gnomon and its strange, beautiful words. Once, sometimes, always, never, almost, perhaps, again. She reached out and touched the surface of the ordinary sundial. The stone was warm from the morning sun. It was solid and real and unremarkable. But as Alice's fingers rested on it, she felt, just for a moment, a faint vibration, a hum, almost too subtle to detect, like the purr of a cat that is very far away. And she knew. She could not explain how she knew, but she knew that the dream sundial was real. Not real in the way that the ordinary sundial was real. Not solid and tangible and measurable, but real in a different way. A way that did not depend on stone or sunlight or shadow. It was real because she had dreamed it, and the act of dreaming it had brought it into being. And once something has been brought into being, once it has been thought or imagined or felt, it exists somewhere in some form, and it cannot be unthought or unimagined or unfelt. Alice took her hand away from the sundial and looked up at the sky. It was so blue, so ordinary and so blue, and somewhere beyond that blue, beyond the thin layer of atmosphere that separated the earth from the void, there were stars, ordinary stars, pinprick stars, scattered stars, and among those stars, or between them, or behind them, there was a violet sky with enormous, pulsing lights, and a meadow that stretched to infinity, and a garden where the flowers glowed and the fountains spiraled, and the woman with the galaxy eyes sat on a stone bench and waited for the dreamers to come. Alice smiled. It was a small, quiet, private smile, the kind of smile that does not need an audience, the kind of smile that exists for its own sake, like a flower that blooms in a hidden place where no one will ever see it, but that blooms nonetheless, simply because blooming is what it was made to do. She turned away from the sundial and walked back toward the house. The morning was warming up. The dew was beginning to evaporate, and the garden was filling with the sounds of bees and the flutter of birds and the distant, comfortable noise of the household going about its daily business. Alice's sister was in the parlor reading. Her mother was in the kitchen preparing lunch. Her father was in his study writing letters. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be. But Alice carried the garden with her. She carried it like a secret, like a treasure hidden in the lining of her coat, close to her body, where no one could see it, but she could feel its weight against her chest, solid and reassuring and real. She knew that the feeling would fade as the day went on. It always did. And that by the time she went to bed that night, the memory of the garden would be no more than a faint trace, a whisper, a ghost of a ghost. But she also knew that the garden would be there when she closed her eyes. It would be there in the space between waking and sleeping, in that thin, gossamer membrane where the real and the imagined meet and mingle and become, for a few precious hours, indistinguishable from one another. And that night, when Alice climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin and closed her eyes, she felt it again, that gentle pull, that slow, creeping tide, that sense of the world softening at its edges and becoming something other, something more, something deeper and stranger and more beautiful than the world of daylight and reason and ordinary things. The violet sky appeared. The enormous stars pulsed. The meadow stretched away to infinity. The path wound through the tall grass. The blue-leafed wood rose on either side, its silver bark gleaming in the soft, underwater light. And ahead, through the trees, Alice could see the glow, the warm, amber, heartbeat glow of the garden of lost things, waiting for her, patient and eternal and always, always there. She walked toward it, and the garden opened before her like a flower. And the woman on the stone bench looked up and smiled that small, gentle, sad and happy smile. And the fountain spiraled its unbroken ribbon of water, and the roses beat their slow, steady rhythm, and the lilies held their drops of other dreamers' light, and the violets breathed their impossible perfume, and the sundial stood silent and wordless in the center of it all, measuring something that could not be measured by shadows. And Alice was home, not the home she lived in during the day, the brick house with the garden and the sundial, and the parlor where her sister read books without pictures. That home was real, and it was good, and she loved it in the way that one loves the things one has always known. But this home, this garden, this place, this dream was home in a different sense. It was the home that existed before homes, the home that was not a place, but a state of being, the home that every dreamer carries within them like a seed that needs nothing to grow but the darkness of closed eyes and the willingness to let go. Alice let go. She let go of the day, of the sundial, of the roses with their dewdrop rainbows, of her mother's tea and her sister's smile and her father's letters. She let go of the ordinary world gently, the way you might release a butterfly from your cupped hands, not throwing it, not pushing it, but simply opening your fingers and letting it fly. And the garden received her. The garden always received her. The garden received every dreamer who came to it, no matter how briefly, no matter how faintly, no matter how little they remembered when they woke. The garden did not judge. The garden did not demand. The garden did not ask for anything. It simply was a place of light and peace and beauty that existed for no reason. And for every reason that served no purpose, and yet was the most purposeful thing in all of creation, because it was a place where the soul could rest. And in the garden, Alice rested. She sat on the cool, soft grass among the glowing flowers, beside the spiral fountain, under the violet sky with its pulsing stars, and she rested. She did not think. She did not speak. She did not explore or question or wonder. She simply rested, the way a river rests when it reaches the sea, not stopping, not ceasing to be, but becoming part of something larger and deeper and more peaceful than itself. The garden held her. The garden held all the dreamers, the ones who remembered and the ones who forgot, the ones who came every night and the ones who came only once, the ones who arrived in terror and the ones who arrived in wonder. The garden held them all gently in its glowing, beating, breathing embrace, and it asked nothing of them except that they be there, that they be present, that they allow themselves for a few precious hours to be exactly where they were. And the night deepened, and the stars turned, and the earth rotated slowly on its axis, carrying the sleeping world through the darkness and toward the dawn. and in a small bedroom in a brick house in the English countryside, a young girl named Alice slept and dreamed, and her dream was a garden, and the garden was a dream, and the boundary between the two was as thin and as fragile and as beautiful as a soap bubble, and it held, as soap bubbles sometimes do, for exactly as long as it needed to, and then softly, gently, like the last note of the nightingale's song fading into the dawn, the dream began to release her. The glow of the flowers dimmed. The sound of the fountain grew distant. The violet sky paled. The woman on the bench nodded. Once, slowly, and Alice felt the garden loosening its hold on her, its fingers uncurling one by one, its warmth receding like a tide going out, leaving behind only the memory of warmth, the knowledge that warmth had been there, the certainty that it would be there again. Alice opened her eyes. Another morning, another blue sky, another day of ordinary, beautiful, precious life. She lay in her bed for a moment, breathing, feeling the transition settle within her, the shift from one world to the other, from the garden to the house, from the dream to the waking. And then she got up, and she lived her day, and she was glad. But somewhere deep within her, in a place that no one else could see, and that she herself could only barely perceive, a flower glowed. A single, small, amber light, pulsing gently, steadily, in the rhythm of a heartbeat. The heartbeat of a garden, the heartbeat of a dream, the heartbeat of the place where all dreams go when they are not being dreamed, the place where they wait patiently and without complaint for the dreamers to return. It would be there for as long as Alice lived. It would be there after. It would be there always, in the in-between, in the garden of lost things, in the space between sleeping and waking, between the real and the imagined, between the story and the dream. Always, or perhaps again, for the end